This morning, though, however, I'm going to shift gears a little bit, as we're going to talk about the subject of suffering again. Now, I titled my message today, Suffer Well, Done with Sin, because Peter is going to point us in the direction of living a holy life, but to accomplish that feat, we will need to learn to suffer well. It's not good enough, actually, to just learn to suffer. But we can do it because we can do it poorly. We can do it with loathing, selfish thoughts, and questioning God's goodness and love. We must learn to suffer well. That means we need to learn how to suffer like Jesus. He is our example. Now, we're going to unpack 1 Peter chapter 4, 1-6 here shortly. But some of you here today might be having a great day. You are full of energy, you're spunky, you're smiley all the time. And some of you might have come here today and your hearts are full and they weigh heavy. And I don't know where you are at, but there's something that the Lord wants you to know this morning. He loves you. He is with you. He's walking with you. You see, the problem that we have today is the problem of suffering. Our culture teaches us that suffering is bad, and we are to avoid it at all costs, to stop it in every way. And in a lot of ways, I agree with them. But now we realize that suffering is impossible to avoid. Now, I agree that some suffering is absolutely evil and wrong, especially the kind of suffering that we inflict on others through sin. As has been mentioned in our prayer time, Turkey and Syria are suffering because of the massive earthquake. As I wrote my sermon this week earlier, I think it was on Thursday, I saw the statistic. The death toll was at 17,000 people. Today is 33,000 people that have lost their lives. Parents have lost children, and children have lost parents. Suffering definitely has an evil side to it. Even the death of Christ on the cross had an evil side to it. It's when people are killing an innocent man. But the thing is, though, about suffering is that it can have a positive side to it. And we as Christians need to have a healthy understanding of suffering. We need to come to some sort of conclusion that suffering will actually help us in our faith. And so in our text today, we're going to look at how suffering can help us to stop sinning. And suffering can help us draw closer to God. This last weekend, Harold and I had a wonderful time in Canmore. We were at the Pastor's Encounter weekend. And during our sessions, our regional director, Mark Breitkreitz, shared some of his story and journey after discovering he had stage 4 cancer. He recalled one pivotal moment when he was in church one day, and God caught him. He said, we caught him flat-footed. And he asked Mark, he said, Mark, would you rather not have cancer and go back to the relationship we had before your cancer, or would you rather have cancer and enjoy the relationship we have now? And Mark said with all joy in his heart and joy and love in his eyes, he would choose cancer. Pain and suffering can lead us to deeper relationship and a holier life with God. We just need to be able to see how pain can be our friend. We can rejoice. We can have joy while we hurt. But I'm going to tell you a secret. It is impossible to understand what I am saying this morning about pain and suffering unless you have suffered and found yourself drawing closer to God through it. It is an experiential knowledge that we must develop. It is one thing for me to be able to tell you, oh, I know what it'll feel like if I fall off this stage. It's quite another for me to fall off the stage and feel it. Now, thankfully, I have fallen off a stage and know what it feels like. I've also fallen off of a grad roof before. Sometimes the pain we endure is because of stupidity, like mine, just sitting on the edge of a roof. Sometimes the pain comes to us and we didn't ask for it. But those of you here today, and I think there are many of you who have suffered in some way, you know without me having to explain it, what it's like to have your faith and love for God grow. And so today in 1 Peter chapter 4, we're going to look at the positive side of suffering, even if it's caused with evil intent. Allow me to read the text. Therefore, since Christ suffered in his body, arm yourselves also with the same attitude, because whoever suffers in the body is done with sin. As a result, they do not live the rest of their earthly lives for human evil desires, but rather for the will of God. For you have spent enough time in the past doing what pagans choose to do, living in debauchery, lust, drunkenness, orgies, carousing, and detestable idolatry. They are surprised that you do not join them in their reckless, wild living, and they heap abuse on you. But they will have to give an account to him who is ready to judge the living and the dead. For this is the reason the gospel was preached even to those who are now dead, so that they might be judged according to human standards in regard to the body, but live according to God in regard to the Spirit. Point number one of my message this morning is about a proper attitude, and it's in the first half of verse 1. Peter starts off with reminding his readers that suffering is actually good for the Christian life. And if they want to survive persecution and endure it, they're going to need to learn how to be obedient to God. And to do that, you're going to have the same attitude as Jesus. Now remember, look at the suffering Jesus endured. What was his attitude like? This attitude towards suffering requires a Christian to surrender to God. You see, without the willingness and dedication to surrender 100% of our lives to God, we will not be able to endure persecution and suffering well. Let's take a moment to think about what it means to surrender to God. First, it means you don't have a right to live your way. Your life belongs to God. Why? Because you gave it to him. Second, it means you don't have a right to treat people the way you want to treat them. You treat them God's way. And third, it means you don't get to dictate how life should be for you. For instance, a life without trials, annoyances, and trouble. Your life is to walk in the path that God sets for you. Peter is directing these people to Jesus, who lived life according to the way God the Father wanted him to live it. He was in complete obedience the entire time. We need to do the same. As impossible as we might think that is, we have to keep trying. No matter what comes our way, no matter who hurts us, no matter what they say about us, no matter the lot we receive in life, with all of its details, our job is to surrender to God's will, to not complain, but rather to serve. Our job is not to get revenge, but to wait upon the Lord. I don't know about you, but these thoughts bring two feelings into my heart. First, I'm filled with passion and dedication by wanting to follow Jesus and live God's way. Second, sometimes life sucks. I hate annoyances. I'm bothered by stupid people, and I would rather be in heaven with God than endure the sufferings of this life. In other words, I want the easy life. I want the life without pain, without annoyances, without stupidity, without aggravation. I'm not alone. Peter is telling me to check my attitude. If I really want to live for Jesus, and I have really surrendered my life to Him, I need to have an attitude towards the painful parts of life that models what Jesus did and how Jesus felt. I need to be able to see the world the way Jesus saw it, to see suffering the way He saw it. This leaves us with the question, why? Why have the same attitude as Jesus? Reason number one. This is my second point this morning, is reason number one. It helps with obedience. So from the second half of verse 1 to verse 2, Peter writes that we are to have the same attitude as Christ because he who has suffered in his body is done with sin. Now, if you remember the last message I preached from chapter 3, there are some options on how to interpret these verses. Some of the things that Peter writes in this first letter are a bit controversial or with a variety of opinions. And so what I'm going to give you this morning is just give you my take on what these verses are saying. All the while, I do respect that other commentators and scholars will have a difference of opinion. But in this text, I think Peter is saying that since it was Christ who suffered in his body, and then right afterwards he talks about and moves into the talk about Christians who need to arm themselves with the same attitude, I think it makes sense that he is still talking to Christians in the next clause, which says, he who has suffered in his body is done with sin, meaning that the Christians who suffer in their body need to be done with sin. And so what this means is that suffering can help us get rid of sin in our lives. The Christians Peter is writing to in Asia Minor 2,000 years ago need to know that they can learn to not sin by suffering the persecution they have been enduring. In fact, our brains are wired that way. We experience pain and we know not to do that the next time. For instance, you can say, oh, look, there's a hot stove. I touched that hot stove with my tongue last time. Maybe I shouldn't do it again. And for us guys, we typically try it again, and maybe with our foot or with a wet hand to see how long we can hold it on there for with cold water or something, just to see. Eventually, we guys learn. Pain helps us to know what not to do, including the pain that people inflict on us. It helps us to know that sin is something we want to avoid inflicting onto others. So instead of living life for human desires and for human nonsense, we can live for and in the will of God by learning to be obedient through pain. And then Peter gives a second reason why we need to have an attitude like Jesus, which is my third point. You sinned enough. Suffering can work obedience into the life of a Christian, and we can see this theme all over the place in the Bible, actually. Not only do we see it here in 1 Peter, but if you look over into James chapter 1, verse 2 to 4, and I'll read the verses, and they should be up on the screen for you. And it says, "Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything." You know, when I first became a Christian, I think it was in grade 11, we did a Bible study on the book of James. And I remember reading this. It's like it's the second, third, and fourth verse of James. And I read that. And as a teenager, I looked at that and I thought, that's stupid. Who would have joy when you're facing trials and pain and suffering? I didn't understand it. I didn't get it. But you see, the testing of our faith develops perseverance. And until we learn perseverance, we won't get the suffering passages in the Bible very well. Because perseverance develops, what does it say in the text? Maturity. One of the best ways for you to grow in your faith and to be a mature Christian is to suffer. I'm sorry, but it's true. because it is through that that you can choose to live a life of faith and trust God through whatever comes your way. And you know, those of you who have suffered, you know what I'm talking about. But in verse 3, Peter tells us here, and tells the Christians actually, that Christians have sinned more than enough for a lifetime. And as Scott McKnight in his commentary said, it's time for them to get on with life of obedience. Stop doing what you did in the past. Let's get on with a Christian life. Let's get rid of those bad habits. And so to sum up what is being said here, we get the impression that Peter is telling them to use the suffering that they're going through to help them develop obedience to Jesus and to remember that they have sinned more than enough in their life, and it's time to stop. It's time to resist temptation, to remember Jesus' attitude towards suffering, even when it's unjust, and to take the opportunities to grow when they present themselves, especially the opportunities of pain. Now, I have 5 points on my message, and so I'm rattling through them pretty quick this morning. But point number 4 is about old friends, verses 4 to 5. Lately, I have been thinking about friendships, and I've been actually talking with my wife about my friendships. I have some friends that are not Christian. In fact, some of them live quite literally the opposite way that I do. Their values are different, their beliefs are different, their lifestyle is different. One of the verses that is always stuck in my head is this, and it's been stuck in my head since I was in grade 12. He who walks with the wise grows wise. You could repeat after me, or say what's left of the verse. But a companion of fools suffers harm. Now, there's 2 things about this verse. One, I think this verse can be taken too far. And second, I think it can be not taken far enough. Let me explain. Sometimes we hang out with people who are just bad company, and their influence on us has been subtle at first, but over time we notice that we have developed some of their bad habits. We will all see that. That is where we know that we might have to limit our interaction with them. And secondly, we need to make sure we develop some solid Christian friendships. Sometimes we use this verse to never have a friend that isn't a Christian. And so then we have no one to be able to share the gospel with or to witness to. In my own journey, I have shared Jesus with my non-Christian friends. When I became a Christian at the end of grade 10 in high school, I thought, okay, these are my friends, and I'm trying to live a different way, so what do? Well, I shared Jesus with them. I tried to encourage them to come to church and to my youth group. None of them did. And within 3 months, they didn't want anything to do with me. Even though I supported them as friends, cared for them, loved them. Every once in a while, I notice that when I hang out with my non-Christian friends, I'll start to act like them. And so I start asking the questions, how much do I limit my interaction with my non-Christian friends? Friends of a long time ago, they didn't want anything to do with me. Friends today, well, they live such an ungodly and unholy life. What do I do with them? What Peter is talking about here is to these people that they've had good, solid friendships, but all of a sudden, these people came to Christ, and their friends didn't. Their old friends didn't understand why they didn't pursue their sexual sins and getting drunk anymore. In fact, their old friends started heaping insults on them and mocked them. I know exactly what that's like. In our day and age, Christians get mocked for not getting drunk, for only having sex with our spouse, for not swearing, treating people with disrespect, driving carelessly, and accepting worldly views that are just so prominent and inundating our minds through the media. This is so common. It happened 2,000 years ago, it happens today, and it will happen to the end of the world. Being mocked or persecuted because you are a Christian will happen. It might not sound like a very pleasant thought, but it's a promise. It's true. So Peter is encouraging them to look to Jesus, who suffered the same treatment they are enduring. Don't forget that one of the guys that hung out with Jesus for 3 years betrayed him. We need to look to Jesus' attitude and how he loved people in spite of their hatred for him. Jesus even surrendered and submitted to the point of death for them. So when Peter tells them in verse 5 that the persecutors and tormentors will face the judgment of God, I think this would have brought some sort of sense of relief to the Christians, knowing that people are going to answer for what they've done. But I think it also made them think twice. Oh yeah, God judges my sin too. Peter here says that God will judge the living and the dead. This is the threat of judgment to those who sin. Which means that Christians wanting God's judgment for their mistreatment and persecution must also look inward and allow the suffering they're enduring to push them away from sin and to not sin or to retaliate back. Because God is the judge, the perfect judge. Now Peter is going to continue this theme of judgment in verse 6, but he adds I call it an afterthought. Point number 5, preaching to the dead. So we have another wonderfully controversial passage that typically can be interpreted 3 ways to answer the question, who are the dead in verse 6 that the gospel was preached to? I'm going to share with you the 3 points of view. It is either those whom Christ preached to after his crucifixion. That interpretation requires you to go all the way back to chapter 3 that I preached on last time. Remember, it said that Jesus went to preach to the spirits in prison after he died? This interpretation requires you to interpret that text that Jesus went to preach to people who were dead in Sheol. Second point, or possibility here in this text, is the gospel was preached to those who were spiritually dead, but are now alive in Christ because of the belief in the gospel. And the third point here, or the third option, it refers to the Christians of Peter's churches who have actually already physically died. And so the gospel was preached to them, but they have already passed on. The vast majority of the commentators believe it is the third option. The gospel was preached to people, but at the time of when Peter wrote this letter, many of them had physically died. But what is interesting is that Peter reveals the ultimate purpose of preaching the gospel at the end of verse 6. That people might believe in Jesus. Preaching the gospel to our neighbors is not for us to get laurels or to put a feather in our hat. Preaching the gospel to our neighbors, our friends, and family is not so that we can feel proud that we finally did it. The ultimate purpose for us to share the gospel is that so people don't go to hell, but go to be with Jesus in heaven. Those who hear the gospel and die for the gospel, even though they are persecuted, will be vindicated, just as Christ was vindicated. How do we apply this text? This passage, this whole entire letter, first of all, is steeply embedded in an ancient culture whose recipients were facing persecution unlike anything we have ever experienced. I think there is a way to apply this text here to our lives in North America. But we need to be careful and honor the fact that we will not be able to understand the intensity in which Peter's message would hit the hearts of his readers. So for me, as a guy who read the text, studied the text, is preaching the text, I have to be able to admit I'm not going to get this the way that they did. But there are some things and ways that we can apply this text here today. The first one is moral living versus Christian living. I think it is important to make a distinction between being a moral person versus a Christian person. A moral person will try to live by a positive moral life that uplifts humanity, treats people with dignity, and lives in charity. But a Christian does not live a moral life simply because it is a good way to live, or primarily because it uplifts humanity, or because it is better to live a life of charity than selfishness. A Christian is moral in character because that is what Jesus did. We are not humanists. We are Christians. We try to think like Jesus, have attitudes like Jesus, have morals like Jesus, have beliefs like Jesus. How we live is not about our preferences, our rights, our freedoms, or our ideology. We live a very specific life, a life like Christ. I'm not simply a nice guy. I like to think of myself as a nice guy, by the way. I'm not simply a nice guy simply because I want to be. You are not here at church simply because it is a good thing to do. We do not selflessly give to the poor or help the homeless and heal the wounded simply because we want to or because it benefits humanity. We live the way we do because morals are centered in the character of God, not in a subjective concept of right and wrong. And the best focus and clearest place we find the character of God is in Jesus, who is God in the flesh. Our theology needs to be Christocentric. Our morals need to be Christocentric. Our lives need to be Christocentric. We surrender everything to Jesus, and we live out God's will, God's truth, and God's way. The second way we can apply this text is with the threat of judgment. Sin demands to be judged. Sin is against the character of God, and it is God who judges it for what it is. So when we sin, we are judged. When the world sins, it is judged. The only way to escape the judgment of God is by being forgiven. Forgiveness is only found by placing our faith in Jesus, His death, His resurrection. And while we receive God's forgiveness and faith, we must also take the next step and make sure we live a holy life according to the character of God to prevent further pain, judgment, and discipline coming to us. But when you do face God's discipline, use it to grow. 3, former friends. We need to do an inventory of our friendships. I'm doing that right now. I think it is a good thing to have non-Christian friends so that we can share Jesus with them, we can love them, but we also must notice that what happens if we become more like them, rather than them becoming more like Jesus. And if that's the case, you may have to consider limiting your interaction with them. And then build solid Christian friendships. And then we can help each other live like Christ. 4th, suffering as friend. I know a lot of people might not like me saying that pain can be our friend. But we can rejoice in suffering for Jesus because Jesus suffered for us. Pain and suffering can be your friend, but you have to treat it as such. Otherwise, it can consume you into depression, fatalism, and hopelessness. This is the reason why Peter's letters are so difficult for us to understand here in North America. We just didn't face the persecution they did. The depth of pain and suffering we endure changes the depth in which we understand Peter's letter. But I think we can get the point, the gist of it. Even though experientially we will yet need to be tested. Some of us here have suffered greatly and know that the presence of God is truly powerful while we are in pain. The hope of God is truly breathtaking when we experience pain. The inward, enduring, personal communion we have with God truly grows in depth and intensity when we are in pain, if we choose that path. And if you're suffering today, or if you suffer tomorrow or sometime in the future, cling to God. Rest in His presence. Find hope in the gospel. And allow the pain to push you towards holiness. Do not despair when you suffer. God is with you. Do not give up when you're hurting. We have victory in Jesus, and the path forward to heaven is already laid out for us. Remember, God is the judge, and He is also forgiving, comforting, and passionate about you. He is turning His face towards you, so keep your eyes fixed on Him. He is the God of your story, even a painful story.